Welcome, weary traveler. I see the long road in the dust on your cloak and the tiredness in your eyes. I am glad you found the light of my fire in this long, dark night. Come, sit closer. Lay down your heavy pack. There is warmth here and a safety that the wild woods cannot offer. This old stone archway will keep the worst of the rain at bay. For now, the world outside, with all its noise and its hurry, it can wait. Let the sound of the rain wash away the troubles of your day. With each drop that you hear, let a worry be carried away, returning to the earth. Let the gentle dance of the embers chase the cold from your bones. Feel their warmth on your face, on your hands. You have journeyed far enough. You have done enough for one day. Soon I will share a tale with you, a tale from the old times of forgotten kingdoms and unwavering honor, of whispers that still echo in the stones, of fallen castles. But that time is not yet, for now there is only this moment, this fire, this peace. Simply rest your mind. I see the weight of your journey still rests on your shoulders. Let the warmth of the fire melt it away. Feel the muscles in your jaw unclench. There is nothing to do, nowhere to be. Just be here. Breathe now. I will keep the watch tonight. You have nothing to fear. All is well, friend. All is well. Good. The crackling of these embers reminds me of another fire from a lifetime ago. It began on a night much like this one, with rain drumming against the shutters of a small inn near London's walls. I was younger then, though already I had lived more years than most men see in their entirety. The weight of my mail felt heavier in those days, not from its iron links, but from the burden of watching kingdoms rise and fall like wheat before the scythe. It was the winter of great uncertainty, when the realm had no king. Uther Pendragon lay cold in his tomb, and the nobles circled like ravens over Carrion, each believing themselves worthy of the crown. I had served many lords in my long years, had seen the best and worst of men who claimed dominion over others. But this tale is different, for I was there when the impossible became manifest, when a boy's trembling hand changed the course of history. The wind howls tonight as it did then, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and the promise of change. I remember how the very air seemed charged with possibility that December morning, as if the world itself held its breath in anticipation. Come, settle yourself by the warmth. Pull your cloak closer. Let me tell you of that bitter morning when I witnessed the birth of a legend, when fate chose its champion not from among the mighty, but from the humble. The frost had painted delicate patterns on the cathedral windows that dawn, like the work of some celestial artisan whose brush was dipped in starlight. Each crystal formation told a story of the night's cold breath, and I found myself studying them as I made my way through the narrow streets of London. My boots, worn smooth by countless journeys, clicked against cobblestones that gleamed like polished pewter beneath a thin sheen of ice. The city in those early hours was a place transformed. Gone were the usual sounds of commerce and daily life. No merchants called their wares. No wheels rattled over stones. No children's laughter echoed from the alleyways. Instead, there was only the soft whisper of snow beginning to fall, each flake a tiny messenger from the heavens above. The air was so crisp, it seemed to ring like a bell with each breath I drew, and I could taste the metallic promise of more snow to come. I pulled my woolen cloak tighter about my shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of my sword at my side. The blade had been with me for longer than I cared to remember, its leather-wrapped hilt worn smooth by my hand over decades of service. It was a good sword, faithful and true. But on that morning, I sensed it was to be overshadowed by another blade entirely. Word had spread like wildfire through the realm in the 3 days since the stone's appearance. Merchants' wives whispered of it in the markets, their voices hushed with awe and fear. Tavern keepers spoke of nothing else as they served their ale. and I had heard more than one man claim he would try his hand at drawing the blade. A great stone had appeared in the churchyard of St. Paul's during the night, as if placed there by divine hand while the city slept. Some said they had heard singing in the darkness, voices like silver bells carried on the wind. Others claimed to have seen lights dancing around the cathedral. Though whether angelic or otherworldly, none could say. Embedded within the stone's gray surface was a sword, and upon the stone itself, words carved in letters that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Whoso pulleth out this sword from this stone is right wise king of all England. The letters, I was told, were deep and clean, as if cut by a master mason, yet no one had seen them carved. They had simply appeared with the dawn, as much a part of the stone as the sword itself. As I approached the great cathedral, its spires rising like prayers into the gray morning sky, I could see that I was not alone in my curiosity. Despite the early hour and the bitter cold, a crowd had already gathered in the churchyard. Their breath rose like incense in the frigid air, creating a small cloud above the assembly that caught the weak morning light and glowed like a halo. Nobles in their finest cloaks stood alongside common folk, wrapped in rough wool and patched leather. I recognized many faces from court, lords and ladies, whose names carried weight in the realm. Duke Cador was there, his silver beard frosted white in the cold, speaking in low tones with Lord Gorlois. The Archbishop Dubricius himself had come, his holy robes a splash of purple against the gray stones, his aged hands clasped before him in prayer. But it was not just the wealthy and powerful who had come. Blacksmiths with hands stained dark from their forges stood next to farmers whose fingernails carried the honest dirt of their fields. Serving girls peered around their mistresses' skirts, their eyes wide with wonder, while young boys climbed upon their fathers' shoulders to get a better view. Even the beggars had come drawn perhaps by the hope that divine intervention might lift them from their poverty. The murmur of hundreds of voices created a constant whisper that seemed to echo off the cathedral walls and return transformed, as if the very stones were adding their own commentary to the proceedings. I could hear fragments of conversation carried on the wind, prayers and curses mingling together like oil and water. Speculation about the sword's origin, debates about whether it was divine blessing or devil's trick. Some crossed themselves repeatedly, their lips moving in silent prayer. Others whispered of sorcery and dark magic, their eyes darting nervously about as if expecting demons to materialize from the morning mist. A few hardy souls had brought food and drink, understanding that this day might be long indeed, and the scent of fresh bread and mulled wine added warmth to the cold air. I found myself a place near the cathedral wall, with a shadow of a flying buttress, offered some shelter from the wind that had begun to pick up, carrying with it the promise of heavier snow to come. The stone wall at my back was old and weathered, carved by craftsmen whose names were forgotten, but whose work would endure long after kingdoms fell. From this vantage point, I could see clearly across the churchyard to where the stone waited. The stone itself was magnificent in its simple power, taller than a man by half again, hewn from what appeared to be granite of the deepest gray. It stood in the center of the churchyard like an ancient monument to forgotten gods. Its surface was smooth as silk, unmarked by tool or weather, as if it had been polished by time itself until it gleamed like dark water. The sword protruded from its surface as naturally as a flower grows from earth, the blade catching what little light filtered through the heavy clouds above and throwing it back in silver gleams. The hilt was wrapped in leather, worn smooth by age, dark brown like autumn leaves, and bound with silver wire that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The pommel bore engravings too intricate for my old eyes to decipher from where I stood, but I could see they formed patterns that seemed to shift and dance when I wasn't looking directly at them. The blade itself was neither ornate nor plain, but something perfectly between. A weapon made for use rather than display, yet possessing a beauty that spoke of masterful craftsmanship. Around the base of the stone, someone had placed rushes and winter flowers. Though who had done so, and when, no one could say. The pale petals seemed to glow against the dark granite, and I noticed that despite the frost that covered everything else, these flowers showed no sign of the cold's touch. A small mystery within the greater mystery, like ripples within ripples on a still pond. As the morning light grew stronger, filtering through the clouds in shafts of silver and gold, the crowd began to stir with greater purpose. The time for mere observation had passed. Now came the test. I watched as the first of many would-be kings stepped forward from the assembly. Sir Balin was the first to try, and he approached the stone with the confidence of a man accustomed to success. He was a knight of considerable reputation, whose lands stretched across 3 counties. A man built like an oak tree, with arms that could bend iron, and a chest broad enough to serve as a table. His hair was black as a raven's wing, untouched by gray despite his 40 years, and his beard was trimmed to a point that made him look like some ancient god of war. I had seen Balin fight in the Welsh campaigns, had watched him cleave a man in 2 with a single stroke of his blade. His strength was legendary throughout the realm, spoken of in the same breath as the heroes of old. Surely, I thought, as did many others in the crowd, if strength alone could free the sword, he would be our king. The very stones seemed to whisper agreement as he strode across the churchyard, his spurs ringing against the frost-covered ground. He paused before the stone, removed his cloak and handed it to his squire, then rolled back the sleeves of his tunic to reveal arms like tree trunks, corded with muscle from years of training and battle. The crowd fell silent, even the children seeming to sense the importance of the moment. A few snowflakes began to fall, large and soft, settling on Balin's dark hair. Like a crown of crystal, Balin grasped the hilt with both hands, his knuckles white with strain, his feet planted firmly on either side of the stone. The leather grip seemed to welcome his touch, and, for a moment, I thought I saw the blade tremble ever so slightly. He pulled, slowly at first, testing the resistance, then with greater force, as he realized the sword was not going to yield easily. His face reddened with effort, veins standing out on his forehead like rivers on a map, like the tracery of lightning against a dark sky. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the cold, and his breathing became labored as he threw his entire, considerable strength against the stubborn blade. The crowd leaned forward as one, willing him to succeed. Their combined hope had almost tangible force in the cold air. But the sword remained as fixed as if it were part of the stone itself, as immovable as the cathedral spires that rose behind us. Balin pulled until his muscles trembled with exhaustion, until his boots began to slip on the frost-slick ground, until his squires stepped forward in concern for his master's well-being. The blade did not move even a hair's breadth, showed no sign that it had even felt the knight's tremendous efforts. He stepped back at last, breathing heavily, his pride wounded more deeply than his body could ever be. His face was flushed with more than exertion now. Embarrassment colored his cheeks as surely as the cold. The crowd murmured, some with disappointment, others with a strange relief. Perhaps they had not truly wanted it to be so simple. Perhaps some part of them had hoped that kingship would require more than mere physical strength. Balin's squire helped him back into his cloak, the young man's face carefully neutral as he attended his master. But I could see the questions in the boy's eyes, the wondering if perhaps strength of arm was not what this test required. Balin himself said nothing, merely nodded curtly to the crowd and took his place among the observers, though I noticed he kept glancing back at the stone as if it had personally wronged him. One by one, the great lords of the realm took their turn. Lord Gorlois, whose silver hair matched his silver tongue, approached with the confidence of a man who had talked his way out of more difficult situations than this. He was known throughout the court for his eloquence, his ability to persuade even the most stubborn opponent to see reason. Surely, if the sword could be convinced rather than forced, he would be the one to do it. He spoke to the sword as he grasped its hilt, his voice low and melodious, weaving what sounded almost like an incantation. The crowd strained to hear his words, but the wind carried them away before they could reach our ears. Whatever he said, however, the sword remained unmoved by his persuasions. His confidence melted away like frost in sunlight as the blade mocked his efforts, remaining as fixed as ever, despite his silver-tongued entreaties. Duke Cador came next, victor of a dozen battles, his scarred hands telling the story of a lifetime spent in service to the realm. He was a practical man, a soldier's soldier, and he approached the task with the methodical precision he brought to every challenge. He studied the stone from every angle, walked around it slowly, examining the way the sword sat within the granite. He tested different grips, different angles, even going so far as to oil his hands to ensure the best possible hold on the hilt. But all his tactical brilliance meant nothing against this simple stone. Despite his careful preparations, his strategic approach, the sword remained as immovable as the foundations of the earth itself. He tried 3 times, each attempt more desperate than the last, before finally admitting defeat and stepping away with a shake of his grizzled head. Even Archbishop Dubricius himself attempted the task, his holy hands trembling as they grasped the hilt. If anyone could claim divine favor, surely it was he who had devoted his life to God's service. The crowd fell to their knees as he approached the stone, many of them praying aloud that the Almighty might work through his servant to provide the realm with its rightful king. The old priest's attempt was perhaps the most poignant of all. His aged frame shook with the effort, his breath coming in short gasps as he strained against the unyielding blade. When he finally stepped back, unsuccessful like all the others, tears ran down his weathered cheeks. Whether they were tears of disappointment or of understanding, I could not say, but something in his expression told me he was not entirely surprised by his failure. The morning wore on, and the crowd grew restless as failure followed failure. Children began to whimper from the cold, their small faces red with the bite of winter wind, and their mothers pulled them closer beneath woolen shawls that smelled of wood smoke and lavender. Some of the younger ones had fallen asleep against their parents, exhausted by the early rising and the long wait. Merchants who had closed their stalls to witness history found themselves regretting the loss of income as the hours passed without resolution. The smell of roasting chestnuts from a cart near the cathedral entrance mixed with the sharp scent of winter air and the musty odor of too many bodies pressed together in the cold. Someone had brought a brazier and was selling hot wine to warm, frozen hands, the steam rising from the cups like miniature clouds. A few of the more enterprising souls had begun taking wagers on who might succeed, though the odds grew longer with each failed attempt. I heard one bookmaker offering 10-1 against any man succeeding at all, and finding no shortage of takers despite the increasingly obvious difficulty of the task. But I remained in my shadowed alcove, patient as the stone itself, watching and waiting. Something in my ancient bones told me that this day would be different from all others I had witnessed. Perhaps it was the way the very air seemed to thrum with possibility, like the moment before lightning strikes, or the manner in which even the birds had fallen silent, as if nature itself held its breath, in anticipation of something momentous. The snow continued to fall, light and intermittent, each flake a tiny miracle of ice and air. It gathered on cloaks and hoods, on the stone itself, creating a thin white blanket that seemed to muffle sound and soften the harsh edges of the world. The sword remained clear, however. No snow settled on its blade or hilt, as if some invisible warmth surrounded it and kept it free from winter's touch. More nobles tried and failed. Sir Bedivere, young and eager, threw himself at the task with all the enthusiasm of youth, only to learn that passion alone was not enough. Lord Lot, whose lands bordered Scotland, and who commanded respect even among his enemies, found that political power meant nothing to an enchanted blade. Even foreign dignitaries who happened to be visiting the court took their chances, perhaps hoping to claim a crown that was not rightfully theirs to claim. With each failure, the crowd's mood shifted subtly. What had begun as excitement and anticipation was slowly transforming into something else. Doubt crept in like fog. Whispers began to circulate about whether the sword could be drawn at all, whether this might be some elaborate jest or test with no intended resolution. A few began to drift away, convinced that they had wasted their time on impossibility. But others seemed to dig in more deeply, as if their very presence might somehow influence the outcome. They pressed closer to the stone, formed a tighter circle around it, their combined will focused on that single blade, as if they could force it to yield through sheer collective desire. The sun reached its zenith, though it was barely visible through the thick blanket of clouds that had settled over London like a gray woolen cloak. The light was diffuse and pale, casting no sharp shadows, but illuminating everything with the soft, even glow of winter. It was nearly midday when the commotion began at the edge of the crowd. Someone was pushing through the assembly, not with the arrogance of nobility, but with the urgent haste of one on an important errand. Voices called out in protest as people were jostled aside, and I craned my neck to see what new player was about to enter this drama of failures. It was then that the boy arrived. He could not have been more than 16, with hair the color of autumn wheat that caught what little light penetrated the clouds and seemed to glow with its own inner fire. His face was young and unlined, but his eyes held depths that seemed far older than his years, as if he had seen more of life's sorrows than any boy should. There was something in his bearing, a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with birth or station, that made people step aside for him without quite knowing why. He wore no fine clothes, no jewels or symbols of rank that would mark him as someone of importance. His tunic was rough-spun wool, undyed and practical, patched at the elbows with careful stitches that spoke of thrift rather than poverty. His boots had seen better seasons, the leather cracked and worn but still serviceable, and his hose were the plain brown of a working man. A simple leather belt held a knife more suited to cutting bread than defending honor, and his cloak was thin wool that had seen many winters. Yet there was something about him that made me take notice, something that had nothing to do with his appearance. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with a grace that seemed unconscious, or the manner in which his presence seemed to calm the restless crowd around him. Children stopped crying when he passed near, and I saw more than one person turn to watch him with inexplicable interest. I learned later that his name was Arthur, that he served as squire to Sir Ector, and that he had come to the cathedral not to claim a throne, but to fetch a sword for his foster brother Kay, who had forgotten his own blade at their lodgings. They were to participate in the great tournament that had been planned to follow the sword drawing. Assuming anyone succeeded in the task, it was simple duty that brought him here. Nothing more momentous than a younger brother helping his elder. Yet fate has always had a sense of irony, sharper than any blade forged by mortal hands. The boy, Arthur, approached the stone with none of the ceremony that had marked the attempts of his betters. He did not pause to study its surface or to test different grips. He did not remove his cloak or roll up his sleeves. He did not pray or invoke the names of saints or angels. He simply walked forward with the purposeful stride of one accustomed to completing tasks efficiently, placed his right hand upon the hilt as naturally as he might grasp a door handle, and pulled. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than the quiet of falling snow, heavier than the weight of years pressing down upon ancient stones. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, the world seemed suspended, as if time itself had paused to witness what came next. Even the wind stilled, and the snowflakes hung motionless in the air, like tiny stars frozen in place. The sword slid free from the stone as easily as a needle through silk. There was no thunder, no flash of lightning, no choir of angels singing hosannas. There was only the soft whisper of steel against stone, a sound like a sigh of satisfaction, as if the blade had been waiting all along for this moment, for this touch. The sword came free so smoothly, so naturally, that it seemed the stone had been holding it only loosely, like a mother's gentle grasp on a child, ready to walk alone. Arthur lifted the blade and stared at it, his young face pale with shock, and what I recognized immediately as fear. Not the fear of battle or of death, for those are simple things, easily understood and faced, but the terrible fear of destiny. The fear that comes when one realizes that life has just taken an irrevocable turn, that the simple existence one has known is as dead as last year's leaves, swept away by forces beyond understanding or control. The sword itself was beautiful in a way that transcended mere craftsmanship. In Arthur's hand, it seemed to come alive, the blade gleaming with silver fire that had nothing to do with the weak winter light. The engravings on the pommel were clear now, revealing themselves to be ancient words in a language older than Latin, older than the stones of the cathedral itself. They seemed to pulse with their own light, as if the very letters were alive and rejoicing in their liberation. The crowd erupted like a dam bursting under floodwaters. Some fell to their knees in worship, their faces turned upward to the gray sky, as if expecting divine confirmation of the miracle they had just witnessed. Others cried out in disbelief, their voices shrill with denied ambition and shattered expectations. A few of the nobles shouted accusations of trickery, their words harsh and desperate as they grappled with the impossible reality before them. "Sorcery," cried Lord Lot, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "The boy has used dark magic. This is not the will of God, but the work of devils. But his protests were drowned out by other voices, voices raised in wonder and growing recognition. "The king," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Behold, the rightful king." Others took up the cry, and soon the air rang with acclaim that echoed off the cathedral walls and seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. I watched Arthur's face as he heard these cries, saw him flinch, as if each acclamation were a physical blow. He understood in that moment that his life had changed forever, that he could never again be simply Arthur the squire, helper to his foster brother, unnoticed and unremarkable. The weight of kingship was settling upon his young shoulders. Like armor, he was not yet strong enough to bear. Sir Ector pushed through the crowd, his weathered face a map of wonder and sorrow that spoke volumes about the man's character. He had raised this boy as his own son, had taught him to read and write, to ride and hunt, to be honest and kind and true. Now he watched as Arthur was transformed into something beyond his reach, elevated to a station that would forever stand between them like an unbridgeable chasm. I could see the love in the old knight's eyes, mixed with a terrible understanding that he was losing the boy he had raised. When he reached Arthur's side, he did not embrace him as a father might, but instead dropped to one knee in the mud and snow, his head bowed in submission to the crown that had just settled upon his foster son's head. "My lord," he whispered, and in those two words I heard the death of the boy Arthur had been, and the birth of the king he would become. It was a moment of such profound transformation that it seemed to ripple outward through the crowd, changing everyone who witnessed it. We were no longer merely subjects watching a test of strength. We had become witnesses to the birth of legend. Kay, the intended recipient of any sword Arthur might have fetched, stood frozen with his mouth agape, his hand half raised as if to reach for the blade that was no longer his by any right. I could see him struggling to understand that his foster brother had just claimed a birthright that would forever change the balance between them. Where once he had been the elder, the heir, the one with expectations and duties, now he was merely the brother of a king, forever to walk in another's shadow. Archbishop Dubricius stepped forward, his aged hands shaking as he reached toward the blade. The crowd parted before him like the sea before Moses, their reverence for his holy office momentarily overcoming their fascination with the miracle they had just witnessed. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one who had spent decades interpreting the will of the Almighty. "My Lord," he said, and his voice cracked with emotion as he continued, "You are the true king, chosen by God himself to rule over this realm. The sword has proclaimed what birth and blood could not. You are Arthur, rightwise King of England." But Arthur, still clutching the sword, as if it might fly away like a bird if he loosened his grip, looked not at the archbishop or the kneeling nobles or the cheering crowd. His gaze found mine across the assembly, and in his eyes I saw something that made my ancient heart clench with recognition and sympathy. He was afraid, terribly, deeply afraid, not of death or battle, but of the enormity of what had just been placed upon him. I nodded to him then, a small gesture of understanding from one who had carried burdens longer than he had drawn breath, who had seen kingdoms rise and fall, and knew the price that crowns exact from those who wear them. Sometimes I knew the greatest courage is not in the drawing of a sword, but in accepting what that drawing means. Sometimes the hardest battle is not against enemies without, but against the fears within. The wind picked up again, scattering the morning's frost like memories scattered by time. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of hoofbeats on cobblestones. Word would spread quickly now, carried by riders racing to every corner of the realm. By evening, every village and hamlet would know that the rightful king had been found, that a boy named Arthur had drawn the sword from the stone and claimed the crown that had waited so long for its rightful owner. But I also knew, with the certainty of years and the weight of experience, that this was only the beginning. The sword was not an ending, but a commencement. The first note in a song that would echo through the ages, long after all of us were dust. There would be trials ahead, battles both of blade and of will, moments when the boy would doubt the wisdom of that simple pull that had changed everything. As the crowd began to disperse, some rushing to spread the miraculous news, others gathering in small groups to whisper and plot in shadowed corners, I remained in my place by the cathedral wall. Arthur still stood by the stone, the sword heavy in his hands, growing heavier, not with its iron weight, but with the weight of a realm's expectations, a people's hopes, and the awesome responsibility of kingship. The rain began to fall again, gentle at first, then with greater purpose. It washed the frost from the stones and turned the churchyard to mud beneath our feet. But the boy king stood unmoved, as still as the stone from which he had drawn his destiny. The sword in his hands caught the pale light that filtered through the clouds, its blade seeming to glow with inner fire. I pulled my cloak closer and prepared to depart, but something made me pause. Perhaps it was the way Arthur stood so alone in the growing rain, surrounded by people, yet isolated by the crown that only he could see upon his head. Or perhaps it was the manner in which his young shoulders seemed already bowed by invisible burdens, weighted down by the future that stretched before him like an endless road. I found myself walking toward him, my boots squelching in the muddy earth, the sound of my approach lost in the whisper of rain against stone. As I drew near, I could see that tears were mixing with raindrops on his cheeks, though whether they were tears of joy or sorrow, I could not say. Perhaps they were both, for life's greatest moments often contain within them the seeds of both triumph and tragedy. Your Majesty, I said quietly, the title strange on my tongue when applied to one so young, yet feeling somehow right, as if the words had been waiting all along to be spoken. He turned to me, and I saw in his eyes all the confusion and fear and desperate hope of youth faced with the impossible. I don't know how to be a king, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of falling rain. I don't know the first thing about ruling a realm. I can barely manage to remember my duties as a squire. No one does at first, I replied, remembering other young kings I had watched rise and fall like waves upon a distant shore. Kingship is not something one learns from books or masters. It is something one grows into, like a tree grows toward the light. But what if I fail? He asked, and I heard the desperate hope of youth in his voice, the terrible need for reassurance that someone, anyone, believed he could succeed. What if I prove unworthy of this blade, of this trust? I considered my words carefully, weighing them as a merchant weighs gold, knowing that what I said in this moment might echo in his memory for years to come. The sword chose you, I said finally. That means you have something others do not, something that cannot be taught or learned or inherited. What is that? He asked, and his voice was that of a boy, not a king. The right to try, I answered, and perhaps, if you are fortunate and wise, the wisdom to know when to put the sword down. He nodded slowly, though I was not certain he understood the full import of my words. Time would teach him, as it teaches us all, though some lessons come at a price too dear to calculate in any mortal currency. The rain continued to fall as we stood there, king and witness, past and future, meeting in a moment that would be remembered long after both of us had passed into legend. Behind us, I could hear the approaching sounds of ceremony being hastily arranged, the voices of men who would soon surround Arthur with all the pageantry and burden of rule. His simple life was ending with each word they spoke, each plan they made. Soon he would be swept up in the great machine of kingship, surrounded by advisors and courtiers, and all the complex apparatus of rule. But for now, in this quiet moment between the miracle and its consequences, he was still just a boy with a sword too heavy for his hands and a destiny too large for his understanding. I left him there in the rain, knowing that our paths would cross again in days to come. For I had served many kings, and would serve this one as well. As I walked away, my boots splashing through the puddles that were forming in the rutted earth, I carried with me the memory of that moment when the sword came free, when the impossible became real in the hands of a frightened boy. In all my long years, through all the kingdoms I had seen rise and crumble like sand castles before the tide, I had never witnessed anything quite like it. The blade had chosen him. Of that I was certain. Whether that choosing was blessing or curse, only time would tell. But I suspected, as I made my way through the rain-slicked streets toward whatever future awaited, that it would be both in equal measure, as such things always are. The fire crackles lower now, friend, and the rain has gentled to a whisper against these ancient stones. That boy became the greatest king our realm has ever known, though the crown cost him more than any man should pay. But that is a tale for another night. Rest now, and let the embers keep watch.